Hi, welcome to Climate Action for Youth by Youth. Today we have a special guest, Raphie, who has done a lot of research on climate denial, climate deniers, and the sources and evidence behind it. So, hi, Raphie, welcome.
Today in this podcast we're going to be talking about climate denial, and personally I think it's probably one of the most frustrating obstacles to solving this issue, because they're holding everyone back, and essentially, and a lot of people can find it frustrating. So, one of the key things that we will need if you want to solve this issue is how to talk to climate deniers. And a key thing to note is that they don't necessarily need to believe in climate change. They just need to be able to believe in the solutions.
So, what exactly is climate denial?
Yeah. So to start that off, climate denial is people who deny climate change exists. They do this mainly for political reasons or other conflicts of interest, mainly for say you're an oil exec and climate change, and in order to solve climate change, you need to stop drilling for oil, but you still want to make money, right? So what you could do is if you don't care about anyone and want to make profit, you could just put out propaganda to say that climate change doesn't exist or something like that.
So, what can we as youth do to stop fossil fuel corporations from influencing politics and convincing people that climate change doesn't exist?
So, the best thing to do is just talk to people. If people who deny climate change, you can have a talk with them. I think that while coming up with my research, important thing that I found is don't really call them climate deniers. According to Debbie Dooley, an expert in this, calling someone climate denier will just turn them off. And so talk to people. You can also protest and against the companies who are putting out bogus studies. But sometimes they can use that to advantage, to say that they're liberal conspiracy theorists or something else.
So you were talking about before this about how Exxon knew about climate change before any scientific research had come out. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So ExxonMobil was one of the companies that started to deny climate change. So in the 80s and even the 70s stuff, they had researchers who are researching how oil drilling can affect the climate and fossil fuel use. And Bill McKibben wrote in The Nation that Exxon knew everything there was to know about climate change by the mid-80s, and then spent the next few decades systematically funding climate denial and lying about the state of the science. Technically, this isn't illegal. They have all the rights to do this and stuff, but it still puts the world at risk. For example, Lee Raymond, the CEO, he was very outspoken and lobbied against regulation that would curtail global warming. And the company's the company knowledge of this dates back to the 1977 when their senior scientist, James Black, told them about this. Experts also agree that Exxon became a leader in campaign confusion. So, in 1989, the company I created, the Global Climate Coalition of businesses opposed to the regulation of greenhouse gas emissions, which later expanded in 2002. But, this thing was made mostly of fossil fuel companies who, want to deny climate change. And, essentially, they... more recently, after this came out, they've started publicly funding things to say that they support climate change. For example, they sponsored the Paris 2002 Accord to try to fix their image, but they still set us quite a ways back because there's still people who don't believe climate change exists, partially because of them. So they prevented the U.S. from signing the Kyoto Protocol in the 90s to control greenhouse gases, and the tactics didn't even not only did this in the U.S., but they also did this in China and India from signing the treaty. So
another big player in climate denial are the Koch brothers. You have called their machine the denial machine. Can you talk a little bit about how that works?
So the Koch brothers, they also work with fossil fuels. They work in industry. So they also joined the global climate coalition to deny climate change. So they're incredibly wealthy people. They're some of the wealthiest people in the U.S. They're worth over $21 billion each, and in order to protect the profits, after the scientific consensus that climate change exists, they devised a plan to reposition it as a theory rather than a fact. And one of them was quoted saying that when the average person is skeptical whether climate change exists or not, victory will be achieved. So they came up with like a network of think tanks called the denial machine, and like companies and media groups who like lie about climate science, try to stop policies that help global warming and hurt their profits. And also they are like some of the largest donors of money to influence political policies. They donate about $55 million. Have donated about $55,200,000, and their network mainly works in the plans. Oh, wait, what was I saying? The network mainly works in what they try to do. The network does multiple things. So like, essentially, it works as citizens. We normally don't trust what energy industry representatives tell us about climate change, and they know that, and they take full advantage of that. But we do trust these messages when given to us by experts or like by peers. So what they did is they like in 2007 they funded a bogus study that to that concluded that polar bears weren't being affected by climate change. And also they invested $16 million in a university into George Mason University, which to teach people that climate change doesn't exist. And the interesting thing is that while the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change brought together 640 authors from 40 different countries, they admit that they were vastly outnumbered. So, like a skeptic who works with them, Stephen Milloy, he admitted his side was only about 25 people, in a quote, and he said that they were being successful because they are. What was I gonna say? Because he said that. I will just read his quote. So it's really amazing. It's really sort of a band of about 25 people, I guess, maybe a few more. And the most recent polls show more people feel more strongly on my side than on the Al Gore side. So that's like what he says. And also, the main reason this minority of people is able to become such a majority is because Koch has funded dozens of independent think tanks whose staffers make it appear like there are more people who deny climate change than there actually are by writing like articles on the internet. So like the network also launches coordinated attacks on climate change and like is very political on climate change scientists. And they also created the Americans for Prosperity, who pose as like concerned citizens. So like they also fund many other things. They fund business groups, women's groups, college groups, senior groups, church groups, just to help make it appear like there are more people who deny climate change and add to their like chorus of climate deniers. So they have like spent tens of millions in political donations for climate denial, and they know that the denial machine can't quite change science, but what it does is it changes public opinion. And when people point out as Koch is doing this, it plays right into them. Like people protest because this sounds very insane, and they can just simply write it off as a liberal conspiracy theory. And like because when we say that they're doing this, it sounds really far fetched, despite having multiple proof of political lobbying.
So I read a book by Senator Inhofe called The Greatest Hoax, which was considered one of the greatest books about climate denial and one of the greatest collections of proof that climate change doesn't exist. But when I read it, all I got out of it was that there is no evidence that climate change it doesn't exist. So what are some of the arguments you've heard that are behind climate denial?
So like this is like a very specific one, but like in the year 1998, it was actually a record high year, but like the 5 years following that year were cooler. While that is true, that is starting very short back, and it's not really looking in the long term enough. If you look back farther, you can see that the long term trend is rising temperatures. But what they did in this case is they cherry picked the data, and the reason 1998 was like a particularly hot year was because it had a really strong El Nino, making it an anomaly. Also, they point out some facts, like for example, they point out how UV radiation from the sun passes right through CO2 particles and other greenhouse gases, and they and like it's true that it passes right through that, but what they ignore is they ignore the thermal heat. UV radiation does cause heat, but it's not thermal heat; it's radiation heat. But instead, that's what they tell, which is a fact, which is a factually true fact. But in reality, when the UV radiation passes through our atmosphere, it goes to like the Earth, and it warms up the Earth, which like warms up like matter, like plants and other things, and it transforms it into thermal heat. And also, there's thermal heat emitted by the Earth's core into the atmosphere. But thermal heat is just a movement at atoms, so it cannot quite like pass through like CO2 particles, which are very resistant to the heat and insulate it.
So, how can we convince people to believe that climate change exists?
So, when I was looking into this, as you probably know, this climate deniers are really frustrating. So, I found this lady named W. Dooley. She is a Tea Party conservative, and she often hosts talks with like people who don't believe in climate change, but like helps them talk them into convincing it exists. So she says like multiple things. For example, don't use the term climate denier. Instead, use like other terms like someone who's skeptical of climate change exists, because it could really turn people off. And to not actually start out with climate change, but instead focus on like solutions and like more political things. Different political things such as like energy freedom, which is the ability to choose where we get our energy from, energy choice, and like natural competition with the economy between fossil fuels and renewable energy, as well as like how doing this it can increase our national security and not have us rely on fossil fuels, and also like innovation, providing new jobs, new industry, and doing other things. The thing is, though, it's not a lot of people on the left think that's mostly like Republicans who deny climate change, but really it's just like some politicians who've been brainwashed. For example, both Reagan and Nixon were environmentalists. Nixon actually founded the EPA, and he signed the Endangered Species Act, and Reagan pushed the International Montreal Protocol, which banned chlorofluorocarbons because that was damaging our atmosphere. Like, if they were alive today, they probably would believe climate change exists. But, like, and they would also be targeted by, like, the companies like ExxonMobil and Koch Industries. But right now, what was I going to say? Let's see. Right now, that's probably like, the best we could do. And also, and this is a personal thing that I noticed, is that, like, oftentimes when, like, this just goes for arguments in general, but like when you're arguing with someone or talking or debating or something, I find that like just stating your position that's contrary to them usually heats it up and makes conversations get very heated. But instead, like what I usually like to do, I just ask them questions about the position to like point out holes in it. For example, like I was talking to this guy who said that the satellites from NASA, there's a mistake in the study that they did, which concludes climate change exists. And I asked him, like, do you distrust NASA, and, like, do you believe that NASA, like, faked the moon landing or something? And he, like, said no. Then, like, also I asked him a few more questions, just, like, point some holes in his logic and stuff. Like, who created this hoax? And he said, like, the liberal media. He says, like, that's conspiracy theories, but going off on a bit of a tangent. Didn't quite convince him climate change exists, but at least I got him to, like, rethink the position. And often asking questions won't, like, fully convince them, like, if you try to convince me that climate change doesn't exist and I'm like super hard at believing that climate change exists, think of it like from your perspective. They'll try to convince you that it doesn't exist, and you're trying to convince them that it exists. It just creates an argument.
Asking questions just might undermine their thought. And
yeah, just like point out some holes in the logic. They probably won't be like super convinced, but they'll at least take a much lighter position.
Okay, so I was also doing some research on climate denial, and me and my friend, we saw this petition that had all these scientists signing it. So we looked at that climate change didn't exist. It was a petition written by scientists that climate change doesn't exist. But we looked at this petition, and first of all you have to do is check a box that said you were a scientist. So there are massive debates going on with massive climate change denying companies using this petition as evidence, and all you have to do is check a box to say you're a scientist. Also, there were a lot of doctors, there are a lot of geologists, there are a lot of engineers, a lot of fields that don't. A geologist, you can try to draw stuff about climate change, but doctors and engineers, can you really draw conclusions that climate change doesn't exist? I mean, doctors, to study the effects of climate change on a human body, would be admitting that climate change exists in the first place. So, what I've gathered from Raphie's point of view and my point of view is that climate denial really has no point of view. And if you pay attention to what Raphie said about how to talk to climate deniers, I think that you'll be a lot more successful in trying to undermine their arguments and really move ahead with youth activism. So thank you for coming by, Raphie.
Nice pleasure talking with you, Kevin.